Welcome back to How China Works. I'm Brendan Davis, your host, and our other host, Ying Li, will be with us in just a few moments. Today, our guest is Malcolm Clarke. Malcolm Clarke is an English filmmaker. He is an Academy Award winner twice over for Best Documentary Short Film. His most recent film is the feature film Better Angels, and of course that's a reference to the quote, Better Angels of Our Nature. The official summary says this better than I think I ever could. Better Angels is the feature documentary by director Malcolm Clarke. It explores how the world's two largest superpowers, of course the US and China, are racing towards economic and political conflict, yet find themselves undeniably linked and interdependent by the new reality of global economic rivalries and cultural ties. The film captures the compelling personal stories and ideological challenges of why these two countries have the world's most important relationship. So in other words, this is a perfectly tailor-made film for us to discuss a bit on how China works. And even more importantly, the filmmaker himself is someone we are very excited to speak with. One thing that is evident both in this interview and the other interviews I have seen or heard with Mr. Clarke are that he is determined to not be or come across as a propagandist or cheerleader for China, as he very pointedly discussed on a CGTN interview that I saw just yesterday. Among many other things I could highlight from this interview, he discusses what I'm going to paraphrase as the downfall of having American exceptionalism being your default diplomatic metaphysics when the U.S. deals with the outside world, and he offers a few thoughts about how to better approach international relationships. Now, I don't want to spoil the surprise, but as it turns out, empathy, developing it, having it, employing it, is the key to establishing mutual understanding, as it often is. He also speaks especially candidly to the cognitive dissonance that younger Chinese people often feel because they're torn between the wishes, hopes, and dreams of their parents, their friends, and themselves. And I appreciated his perspective that his hopes for the film are really that he wants it to act as a lighthouse to show what's possible. He's not trying to offer proscribed advice or to style himself as a China expert any more than someone like me is, who knows enough to be functional/dangerous on a good day. So I really appreciate his perspective on this, and I'm very excited to see it myself. On a personal and professional note for me, since I'm a film producer, besides doing these podcasts, of all of the Ying-only interviews that I wish I could have attended, this one is up at the very, very top. So I hope that we get to do a round two one day where I get to participate more directly. And on a side note, we have been wanting to get him on the show for some time, but this interview was very much a seized opportunity by the awesome Ying Li. She was at a morning event with Malcolm and got to talking with him again and discuss the show. And then he had this magic window to sit down before his afternoon got busy. So she made this happen on the fly. She had her microphone and her computer where we record. So as a result, the location has a little bit of background noise here and there that just couldn't be avoided. It's especially really in about the first 10 or so minutes. And then again, a bit toward the very end, but their voices sound really good. And I did as many audio, EQ, and mastering tricks as possible. And I think that the content is truly excellent. I can brag on it because it's not me doing the interview. And this is very highly insightful as well. So I hope that the occasional noise will hopefully just add a little bit of local flavor and let you enjoy the real Beijing. Anyway, for now, without further ado, please enjoy Ying Li's interview with Malcolm Clarke.
Thank you for being on our show, Mr. Clarke. Welcome.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it.
Oh, this is a wonderful opportunity here in a quiet place, in a beautiful place here in Beijing. So I'm very curious about what surprises you most since you made this movie, Better Angels.
Ooh, so many things about China surprised me. I suppose the biggest single surprise was how much China had changed kind of out of all recognition since I first came to China. I came when I was a very young man, a very young filmmaker in my early 20s. And in 1981 and 1982, when I traveled around China, it was very different, very rural, I might say very 19th century country in many respects. And obviously, what has happened during the last 40 years is really nothing short of miraculous. And so when I came back, I'd been asked to make a film about China. I was a little bit nervous about coming back and saying yes to the film because I'm not an expert and I really don't know much about China. I'm someone who's been constantly fascinated by what's been happening in the country, but I've never had an opportunity nor the money to make a big film about China. So when this opportunity presented itself, I was both delighted and really quite anxious. I came to China, I saw for myself the changes that had happened, and it was a little bit breathtaking. And I started to realize that the size of the challenge, the size of the task that I'd set for myself, and it was a little bit scary.
So the challenges and the changes are the surprises for you.
Exactly.
From
The
your
challenges,
case.
the changes, and the task of how to tell that story in the length of one movie was a huge and complicated issue that I had to face.
Are there any surprise from the audience after they viewed the movie?
You know, the film was made largely to address what we discovered to be a huge information deficit between China and America. The Chinese tend to understand and know more about America than the Americans know and understand about China. There's a very profound lack of understanding of modern China in the United States. I'd go as far as to say that I think you could challenge almost every American to point to Beijing on a map, and they wouldn't be able to do so. It's actually quite startling how little Americans know about China, and what they do know about China is only what they are being told by their politicians to a very large extent. That to me is a big problem. That to me is profoundly dangerous, because opportunistic politicians use China as a bogeyman, as a whipping boy, as a villain. And one thing that did surprise me quite significantly was how, if I may say so, how poorly China defends itself in telling its own story. And that, I think, it made me understand the kind of responsibility that I had in telling the story of modern China. I didn't want to be a propagandist for China. I didn't want to be a cheerleader for China. But I did want to tell the truth, and I did want to tell Americans something that I feel very keenly, which is that we do not have to be afraid of modern China. We should appreciate what has happened here.
From my understanding, the key message about this movie is to basically demonstrate how important to tell ordinary stories from both sides and let ordinary people from both countries understand that the fact of telling authentic stories. So how this message how acceptable this message to the audience you engaged ever since you make this movie? Do people start to realize more and more realize the significance, the importance of it?
I think when people see Better Angels in the West, and we previewed the movie in the UK, in London, in Oxford, and in the United States, at several places around the US. Interestingly, people in Britain are much more open about China. They are much more level-headed and much more mature. They understand that China is a rising power. They understand that China is undergoing a remarkable renaissance. And frankly, they're impressed. They're not afraid. They don't feel that China is a threat. That tends to be the message that is told to Americans. And Americans, I think, really are much more nervous about what they regard as the rise of China. They don't know enough about China's history to know that it's less a rise than it is a renaissance, that China has been a global power, or at least a world-class power. Maybe, in fact, specifically not a global power. I spoke incorrectly, because China has, throughout history, it calls itself the Middle Kingdom. It's stayed within its borders. It was never an imperial power. It was never a predatorial power. And so, in a sense, the fact that China is now projecting itself into the world through initiatives like the Belt and Road initiative gives Americans a feeling of unease. America was supposed to be the global policeman. America was supposed to be the great shining city on the hill, the exceptional, in their terms, the exceptional power in the world. And I think that rhetoric, the rhetoric of American exceptionalism, is something that is dangerous, because when you tell someone that they're special, that they're unique, that they're better than all the other places, it breeds a certain kind of arrogance, perhaps, and certainly when China becomes, as it is becoming, a superpower, then it breeds a certain amount of fear and anxiety. Because America doesn't understand much about China, it tends to fear it. So what our film tries to do is just put a human face on China. It's actually, I would say it's a simple film. It's also a simplistic film. We don't deal with politicians, with pundits, with experts, with sinologists. We deal, for the most part, with ordinary Chinese and ordinary Americans. And we let them tell their own stories about the way they deal with the other, how American factory workers deal with their Chinese colleagues, how Chinese engineers deal with being away from China for 2 or 3 years building infrastructure for African nations. Quite simple stories, human stories, but collectively, when you add them all together, they build a picture. And the picture, quite interestingly, is that the Americans that we put in our film and the Chinese that we put in our film are very, very similar. Very similar in their emotions, very similar in their desires and their needs, very similar in the way they deal with their families and their communities. That the Americans, the ordinary Chinese, have the same dreams, the same desires for their families and for their futures. And their differences, when they exist, are relatively modest. They are much more alike than they are different. And I think that is that in all this noise, in all this politics, in all this furor about trade and tariffs, and those simple realities are lost. We try to kind of discover those realities again and present them to our audience.
Interestingly, we talk a lot about cultural differences and how people could be more culturally intelligent when engaging with different groups, like for Chinese to engage with Americans and for the vice versa. So basically, this film for me is showcasing more about the cultural similarities, the common issues that all humans face in the world, any corner of the world, young and old, right? So I think that's an example to showcase what humanity is about, right? The basic need. Looking into the future, what do you expect this movie could influence or set as an example for moving this particular initiative that you love to see forward? Like, do you have any particular plans moving forward with this film, or any particular step you want to take further to help promote this mutual understanding between the two different nations?
I think Better Angels can act as a kind of a bellwether, as a kind of a lighthouse to show what is possible. I have no claims that this is a very special film or a particularly good film. It's not for me as the director to say. It's a film that I feel works by my standards, but I'm not a movie critic and I'm not a member of the audience. I can't tell what effect it's going to have. I guess we're going to discover that after July the 2nd, when the movie is released widely in China. But what I do feel it shows to Chinese politicians and to Chinese filmmakers and artists is that if you tell an honest, emotionally open story about ordinary Chinese people, that message will travel farther and deeper and have more impact than any amount of false messaging, by which I mean propaganda. What Better Angels can do is show to Chinese politicians, artists, filmmakers, writers, that if we tell an honest, emotionally open story about Chinese people to people in the West will listen. People in the West will greet those messages and be actually be relieved to receive those messages because they are the victims of their own propaganda from American politicians who opportunistically use China as a villain. So we've shown this film in places, in deep kind of, middle American Trump country, and we've had extraordinarily positive responses because people don't understand China and Chinese people. Once they see that they're just the same as them in so many respects with regard to their country, their ambitions, their families, their needs for basic decency, for good education, all those things, they are relieved. It's like, the Chinese just want what we want. And in a sense, we have to acknowledge in this film that we've discovered that the American dream and the China dream are pretty much the same thing. There's not a lot of difference. And I think those issues need to be taken up at a national level in this country. I have some very good friends at CCTV. They work very hard and they do their best, but their message isn't penetrating outside to the world. The films they make are not really the kinds of films that people in the West want to see or want to watch because they tend to be somewhat propagandistic. And so all I would say is that, Better Angels might be used as an example of how you can tell a good emotional story without having to worry too much about the way the message has been massaged and controlled.
That almost touched this caring and daring topic that I always discuss with our speakers about media literacy and understanding about how media influence our world, our perception, our decision making, our particular attitude toward one particular topic or person. It is same to every country in the world because in the era of AI, in the era of technology, advanced algorithm-controlled society. And there's a lot of things we need to factor into what shaped our mind. Like you just mentioned that in the US, after watching Better Angels, a lot of people start to feel, wow, I didn't know that the China, maybe I know. So do they actually step backward and ask the question, what influenced me to think, to know this particular culture, right? Do you think media professionals, artists, or in the future film professionals will take that angle into future in helping people helping the audience to understand and how they are influenced by a certain group?
Let me say this. Yeah. America has been enormously successful for 100 years in telling its own stories. We all think we understand America a little bit because we watch American movies, television series, we listen to American pop songs, we read American books, they have a free press. There's a lot of open discussion. So we all feel that America is a place we understand a little bit. Even if we don't admire it, we understand it to some extent. I cannot emphasize enough how deeply important media is in today's world. And when I say media, I don't necessarily mean newspapers, because I don't think people read the way they used to read. But they do, they are disproportionately affected by what they see on their cell phones, what they see, the images that they see, the stories that they are told. And so my area, my job is I direct films, has become more and more important over the years in framing the conversation, in framing the subject, in opening people's minds to possibly a different reality than they have been, led to believe up until that point. I don't want to overemphasize what we do. I don't think one movie can change the world. I don't even think that 10 or 15 or 20 movies can change the world. But I do feel that the more we can be consistently open to the idea that images, that stories that are absorbed through screens, whether the screen is a cell phone, whether it's a TV, whether it's a movie screen, the size doesn't matter. The message is important. And the media, as Marshall McLuhan said years and years ago, the medium is the message. This medium that we work in now is hugely important, and it can, over time, it can change people's opinions, it can change the way they vote, change the way they choose their leaders, change the way they deal with their families, change the way they deal with, the other gender. I mean, women now have learned very cleverly that if they want to be seen, as one famous Chinese gentleman said, holding up half the sky, they have to be half a presence in the media. They have to tell their own stories and to be appreciated. So, what we do is not to be underestimated. And what I would like to see, certainly in China, I'd like to see many more filmmakers making far fewer dopey comedies and making more films about the Chinese experience, about the stories of ordinary Chinese trying to live their lives, trying to support their families, the struggles that made China what it is today. So many dramatic stories are waiting to be told. And I would love to see Chinese filmmakers, my peers, because there are some fabulous Chinese filmmakers. I would like to see them use their talents to tell Chinese stories to the world.
A scholar friend of mine who told me that in order to understand how China works, you need to tell stories of three groups in China. The first one is there are about 7 million or 8 million of Chinese public servants. They are working in what we call 基层. So they're not particularly like officials, but they work for the people and help people. They're probably the heads of the village. And those people in China are the information source. People come to talk to, even the village people and talk to them about their problems and the concerns. They observe information and they observe how this society works. And their story, they need to, they have a lot of stories, first of all. I think they need to be taken care of when we psychologically or physically engage with them. Second group is about the private sectors of enterprises. The founders, executives work in the private sectors. So they really work hard to make the Chinese economy today.
Of course.
And the third one would be the people live in the third or fourth tier cities in China. Their story, they're ordinary Bailing, ordinary white collar people, professional. They're on Kuaishou, they're on those kind of video platforms, shooting a small video about how to getting opinion from the audience. How can I buy a birthday gift for my dad? This kind of ordinary people's life. How worthwhile do you think their story to be heard, and how important their story are revealing to showcase how China works?
You know, when you look, I'm going to give you an example from another country. France has a very healthy film industry. They don't make superhero movies. They don't make very big budget special effects movies because they don't have the money and the budgets. But they have a very vibrant movie business that reaches a global audience because they make terrific movies about ordinary ordinary French people. They're the country perhaps on most. Japan is also very good at telling ordinary stories. I think there is a kind of resistance in China to telling ordinary stories. We tend to tell stories in China about emperors, about powerful people, about warlords, about leaders. There's so much value in the story of an ordinary guy trying to figure out how to buy a birthday present for his wife.
I remember you have a particular documentary about a blind guy in China,
Exactly.
right? He is ordinary people, but has extraordinary dream, like the American dream.
Well, that film was made by my colleague and producer Han Yi. It's a brilliant movie. It's called In My Eyes.
盲行者.
And the gentleman at the center of that film is a working class blind Chinese man. He was blinded when he was 8. He wasn't born blind. And that, in a sense, is a particular tragedy because he knows what it felt like to see the world. But when he was 8, he was hit by a car, he was blinded, and after that he was considered by his family, by his community, by his village to be worthless because he couldn't see, so he couldn't earn money. He had a dream. He decided that despite the fact that he couldn't see, he wanted to travel around the world and, quote unquote, see the world, or at least experience the world. Everybody mocked him. Everybody thought he was crazy. His family thought he was completely mad. But so far, he's visited 30 countries.
Wow.
And he's continuing to travel around the world. My colleague, Han Yi, discovered him very early in his ambition. And she followed him. She followed him to Thailand. She followed him to America. She followed him to India. And it's an extraordinarily both inspirational story and a terribly sad story because I think what he is having to go through is something which is perhaps more common in China than we care to express, which is, do you follow your own dream? Do you follow your the thing that your heart leads you to, your ambition? Or do you follow your Confucian responsibility to your mother, your father, your kids, your family, your village, your community? Do you put yourself first, or do you put yourself second? He decided that his dream was the most important to him, and he's fulfilling his dream, but he's fulfilling his dream at the expense of his relationship with his daughter, his family. And that conflict, I think he's living through that conflict. I think that conflict is something which is very common in China.
Very common.
I think a lot of people say, you're to young women, get married, have a family. They send young women to university. You get a fantastic education. The moment you get back from your university with a good degree, they say, okay, now it's time to get married and have kids. What was that education for? So many young women in this country are suffering from that conflict of responsibilities. You want to be a doctor, you want to be a geographer, you want to be a scientist, you want to be a mathematician. And your mother and father who've paid for your education say, we want you to be a mother because we want to be grandparents. We want to follow the Chinese way. I'm not saying that those parents are wrong. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is the societal pressure that is now on young people to either follow their dreams or follow their responsibilities. And those things are in conflict. And that is what makes China both very interesting for me as a filmmaker, but also, I think, a very a very difficult place for young people to kind of deal with at this point. I'm fascinated by it, and there are lots of films that can be made on that subject.
That young blonde guy you just mentioned as a amazing example to showcase one could find his closest relationship between himself with the world is to follow himself, to follow the heart, the bottom of the heart. I think that's a very inspiring story. And we're talking about the role of youth already, kind of. And nowadays, like I'm a young person here, I would say in this universe, I wouldn't just say in just particular country, because right now I think the responsibility on the youth is tremendous. And right, particularly in China, we're witnessing a lot of interesting younger generation that communities. Like there's under One Belt One Road initiative. There's some youth organization from some universities who actually are organizing some intercultural exchange program for the youth from different countries to build dialogues together. Do you happen to have any stories like that? Like right now, the youth from different countries started to pay attention to how they could communicate to each other and be curious about each other's culture and build understanding. And how important do you think this kind of activity play a role in foster win-win situation and better understanding between the countries with different cultures and values?
You know, there's an interesting, very entrepreneurial new social media company called ByteDance, which I'm sure you've heard of. Hugely successful financially, and hugely successful kind of internationally, because it allows young people, and it's mostly young people. It's not entirely young people at all, but it allows young people to make short videos and communicate with their peers all around the world. I find it bewildering. I'm used to make, a 15-second movie to me is kind of, it's a very strange animal. My movies take a lot longer to prepare. But these short, bite-sized communications between young people around the world are breaking down barriers and are bringing people together and are forming all kinds of very interesting, unusual, novel connections which have never existed before. ByteDance is ubiquitous across China. It's growing massively in the United States and in other countries too. And through their apps, they are doing something which I think a lot of people kind of deride them and say, these are just like dopey, silly videos. There's nothing dopey or silly about seeing a Chinese kid doing something stupid that makes an American kid laugh, or an American kid doing something stupid that makes a Chinese kid laugh. Because what that does is it breaks down a barrier that we didn't, I didn't know about Chinese people. They didn't know about us. Now they do. And they know that, we both like to laugh. We both like to act silly. We both like to, it doesn't have to be a strong, important political message. It's a sociological connection which didn't exist and which now does exist. So I feel that this kind of democratization of the information methodology, it sounds highfalutin, but basically the fact that we can all make little movies and send them all over the world and have people consume them, I think that's enormously important and powerful. And I think what it does, it makes the world a smaller place, and it brings all of us together in this, sounds like a cliche, this global village that we all are citizens of. We all need to understand that the color of the skin, the size of the eyes, the kind of language you speak is irrelevant. We all kind of exist on this little tiny spot in the universe, and we have to make it we have to make it as much of an interconnected community as possible. And something like ByteDance, for example, or Facebook, all these things break down barriers. They can be abused as well. They're not just good. They have to be carefully monitored, because we saw with the rise of Nazis in the 1930s that media can be perverted and it can be abusive. So we have to carefully look at the way those messages are used. But I don't think it's a bad thing to have people from different communities and countries speaking to each other and looking at each other and discovering things about each other.
Well, that's a wonderful way to have summarization of our show and our particular episode with you today. That, our purpose is to help the world become China smarter and Chinese going global. In such an ever-shifting world like this, we would like to tell better Chinese stories, of course, and we also want to make this trust, make this belief happen that there are people, there are ordinary people to be able to do that. To how ordinary they are, they could be a bridge between the old and the new, the past and the future. And because we all care about the one thing, that is being caring to other humans. So if you could have one word, like encouraging word for our young audience, do you have a specific expectation or word for them?
I think it's quite difficult to be a young person in China right now for the reasons that I've already highlighted. There's a rising middle class in China. You have more spending power. You have a little bit more money. You have a better education than you've ever had before as a young person. But that brings its own pressures. You are being pressured by your parents to be one kind of citizen. You're being pressured by your peers and by probably yourself and your own ambitions to be another kind of Chinese citizen. So you're being pulled in different directions. That's not easy, but I do feel that, and I think that Chinese young people at this point are in a transitional stage between the old China, where you would just do as your family wished you to do and become compliant to their wishes, and the new China, which is very much like, France, Europe, America, Canada, wherever, where young people determine their own destiny. They say, I'm interested in this, I want to follow this path, and I want to become my own person. So there's a conflict, there's a dichotomy. Because I'm a Western person, and I would like to see China and the young Chinese people be respectful of their parents' wishes, because their parents have been conditioned to think in a certain way, but they must never lose touch with their dreams and their ambitions. And they, in a sense, young people have to work harder at explaining to their parents that if you really want me to be happy, free me to let me follow my own dream. So in a sense, don't reject your parents, but try and work with them and explain to them that if you truly value my happiness, let me be who I want to be. And by being that, I can be everything that you want me to be. I can fulfill your expectations better of being a good son or a good daughter. It's a difficult trajectory for kids to have to arbitrate and to deal with, but I think finally Chinese young people are very lucky because they've been born into New China, which is a very exciting country to be a part of.
We appreciate your insightful and empathetic sharing with us. And thank you so much for being on How China Works.
It's my pleasure to be part of How China Works. Thank you.
All right, that's the show this week. You can visit howchinaworkspodcast.com to learn more about Mr. Malcolm Clarke, to find links to our other shows and show guests, to contact us. Please don't forget to rate, share, review, subscribe to the show wherever you listen. Thanks again for listening. We really appreciate it. And on behalf of Yingling Li, I'm Brendan Davis, and we will see you next week.